So this is our first of the LIBTalks series, brought to you by Western New York Library Resources Council. Today, our guests are Leah M. Halton-Pope, who is Deputy Chief of Staff and Legislative Director for Crystal D. Peoples-Stokes of the New York State Assembly, and Rick Rodgers, who is the Legislative Director for Senator Timothy Kennedy of the New York State Senate.
Welcome, everyone. Thank you for having us here today. I know we're very excited to be able to present to you kind of our knowledge and help you all out with everything you need to know when you come to Albany, help advocate on your behalf, and achieve the ultimate goal of getting additional library funding and additional legislation passed that really help libraries across the state. I know oftentimes it's a very confusing process, especially for people who aren't used to it coming in. So I think Leah and I can really provide a lot of knowledge today to help you out as you go along doing that. I think the first thing to really start covering is the structure of the Assembly and of the Senate. Each Assembly and Senate have different conferences in there. Specifically for the Senate, we actually have three conferences. We have the mainline Democrat conference, we have the Republican conference, and then we have an independent Democrat conference, which is a group of Democratic senators that have formed their own coalition and are currently in a majority coalition with the Senate Republicans. So when you're talking about the Senate, it's really important to figure out where each individual is in a caucus. If it's an IDC or a Senate Republican, they're in the majority. They tend to get a little more done, have a little more power because they really control the agenda, where the Senate mainline Democrats are in the minority, still have a lot of power, but they don't really set the agenda or set how things are going through like the majority coalition does.
In the Assembly, we have just the two. We have our Democratic conference and the majority, and the minority conference is full of the Republicans. So it's pretty normal, I guess, in the Assembly. The Senate is an anomaly, and we enjoy working together. So when the Assembly members put together pieces of legislation, we try to determine who's the best person to carry it. Especially if it's something that's really important to a member or their district. If you're in the majority or you have power to move it, it's easier to get somebody who also has that kind of power, if that makes sense.
Right, it definitely does.
So the senator and the assemblywoman work together quite often on issues that directly impact the city of Buffalo because we have crossover in our districts.
Right.
We represent the entire city of Buffalo.
And then we have all of Lackawanna, all of Cheektowaga, and then we have about 75% of the city of Buffalo. We end kind of midway up into the North Buffalo area.
Yeah, well, we do cut off part of Buffalo.
Right.
That's true. We lose part of North Buffalo and a little bit of downtown, but we have about 90% of it, I would say.
So then further than just conferences, there are committees in both the Assembly and the Senate as well. The committee structure is kind of used to move bills through and also advance some financial budget decisions as well. The key committee, I think, in terms of library funding in the Senate at least, is the Finance Committee. The Finance Committee sets all the budget bills. They really approve any money that's being spent at all throughout the state. And that's really the key element to kind of advocate for additional funding, since they're the ones who set the budget bills and set the agenda for the budget in the Senate at least.
So I would say depending on, the same thing with committees, I guess you want to know what kind of committees we do serve on.
Right.
So the Assembly member is the chair of the Government Operations Committee. She's a member of the Rules Committee, which is chaired by the Speaker, Higher Education, Insurance, Alcohol and Substance Abuse, and environmental conservation. When it comes down to library issues, because your parent agency is state ed, your issues could initially funnel through the Education Committee, which is chaired by Assemblywoman Kathy Nolan, and then any additional funding requests will go through Ways and Means, which would be the accompaniment of the Senate Finance Committee. So any funding requests would ultimately end up going through Ways and Means. And after it's gone through that process, been voted onto the floor, we're going to an agenda and then to the floor for a vote.
And then for Senator Kennedy, he serves on the banks, is the ranker on the Commerce and Economic Development and Small Business Committee. He serves on the Cultural Affairs and Tourism Committee, Energy and Telecommunications, Finance, Insurance, Rules, Transportation, ranker on infrastructure and capital investment, and is also on the Native American Relations Committee in the Senate. So as you can tell, Senate Democrats seem to be on a lot of committees just because there are a set number of committee slots and there are less Senate Democrats than there are Senate Republicans. So we tend to be on a lot of committees, but again, the agenda seems to be set by the actual head of the committees, and they're the ones who really set it and kind of get it off to the floor. So we're just kind of a portion of that to help that happen.
So in the assembly, members can be assigned to a committee by the Speaker of the House. They can also request. So when the assembly member first came on board, she was working on some environmental issues in her previous life through Citizen Action and other organizations, and so she asked to be a part of the Environmental Conservation Committee. And then the Speaker will assign additional committees. So you can choose what you'd like to do. She also became the chair of the subcommittee for Minority and Women Business Enterprises. I don't know if it works the same way in the Senate.
It does. The reason Senator Kennedy is the ranker on small business and economic development is because of the impact of the Buffalo Billion on the city of Buffalo. He felt that that was a very important committee to be on and had requested it and is now the ranking member because of it.
So when you want to know how we get on committees, if you have any questions about that, any member can ask. There might be an opportunity to be on it depending on what the issue areas are. And then the other is just the need, like a speaker or in leadership would determine that this would be a good fit for this individual member.
So I think it's also important to cover there is a libraries committee in the Senate. Mm-hmm. It's not a very active committee. It was formed in 2012. I haven't seen any meetings of it since 2013. So kind of similar to what Leah said in the Assembly, it's really finance and education in the Senate are the two that you really want to deal with whenever you're dealing with any library-related legislation or funding. The Library Committee isn't really as active as it should be, so it's not the best place for advocacy to really go through to get things through.
I think I try to tell people, if you remember, Schoolhouse Rock a long time ago had that how a bill becomes a law. If you don't know, you're like, I'm just a bill. No, you don't know that part. Anyway, the song kind of tells you basically how bills become the law on the federal level. It's exactly the same way on the Senate, on the state level. If you come up with an idea, the libraries want more funding for a particular type of a program, they would go to their member. Sometimes legislators see something in the paper. It prompts them to create a piece of legislation. You draft it, you write some notes. We have bill drafters, they have staff like us. We decide this is a piece of legislation that currently is not in place. It would be beneficial. This is about how much we think it might cost. We work with bill drafters, and the bill drafters are actually joint. They're bipartisan. They work with both the Senate and with the Assembly, so we could possibly have the same bill drafters. They help draft our legislation. It's introduced through a process. Sometimes we can do a uni bill, which means we both put the bill in at the exact same time, so we'll have both members' names on it. When you look at a piece of legislation online, it'll say Assembly and Senate or Senate and Assembly. And then the respective names of both the senator and the assembly member who are carrying the bill. The bill is then sent to committee, depending on what the issue is. So it could be in the Education Committee with a flag on it to go to Ways and Means after it passes through the Education Committee. So if there's a component that specifically deals with libraries that has a financial component to it, it would pass out after it got through the committee, which there's a process. Occasionally, a member would have to do a 99 request, which pretty much in layman's terms would be, please put this on the next committee agenda as soon as possible, and we hope it's favorable. There's a caveat to doing that. Occasionally, you put a 99 request in, and it's held for consideration. And so a chair might ask another, especially majority member, would you mind removing the 99 so they don't have to let your bill die in committee? After it's passed, hopefully it's gotten a favorable vote out of committee, it'll go on to Ways and Means. If there's a financial component to the bill, then after it's passed through Ways and Means, it will go to the floor for a vote. No vote in the Assembly, no bill comes to the floor without a guaranteed at least 76 member approval, like majority member approval. The reason that we say that is because you don't want to undermine the power of the speaker. So you need to have at least 76 people who are in the majority who are on board with this piece of legislation. So we kind of know where bills stand before they hit the floor without necessarily polling members.
Right.
You just have an idea that people are being supportive. So in the process of you introducing your bill, you send out a notification, you being the Assembly we send out a sponsorship memo asking other members of the Assembly to be supportive of it. For the Assemblywoman, she's also a member of the Black Puerto Rican Hispanic Caucus, which is it's a very big caucus, full of members of African American, Latina, Asian descent, both in the Senate and in the Assembly. They decide what issues they want to really get behind. It's really good if you can get all of those members on a piece of legislation that can impact the entire community. It seems to have a little bit more power. And getting those people on there, in addition to other members, 76 at least, can move a piece of legislation to a favorable vote. And then we send it over to the Senate, or vice versa. It comes over to the Assembly. Hopefully it passes both houses, goes to the governor, and then fingers crossed it becomes a law and it doesn't get vetoed.
And it's very similar in the Senate, but as a member of the minority party, we have a little less control over what gets on a committee agenda, what gets brought up to a floor vote. For us, it's even more important to get co-sponsors on it, especially members of the Republican or the IDC, so we can show that there is support outside of our own conference to get something going forward and onto the floor as well. For us, it's a lot of communication with the committee chairman, with leadership, of trying to then get things that are acceptable to them to get out of committee, and then really get the attention of either the IDC or the Republicans to then get it on the floor for a vote in addition to it. So it's a little more legwork, which means we tend to get a little fewer bills passed throughout the year because of it, but it definitely still is as effective, we feel, of getting things through, and it just means that we have to find the right bills to really push for and then make sure we get the attention of the right people to get it on.
Yeah, and we work really closely. So if there is a piece of legislation, for example, we can talk about the parking permit. It's an opportunity.
Sure, yeah.
So the parking permit legislation, there was a piece of legislation in the Fruit Belt here in Buffalo. The medical campus, huge growth, caused a little bit of problems. There's not a lot of driveways in that region, in that area, and so a lot of employees who couldn't afford parking in the garages started parking in front of residents' homes. So the residents reached out to their city council member, who happens to be the council president. He put together a resolution asking for a parking permit program to be started. They sent that to the state. We, meaning the Assemblywoman and the Senator's office, we got together, we put in a piece of legislation, and we fought for a couple years.
It was a fight. It took a long time, but it's something where having the Assembly members' support and having the Senator's support really on both sides really helped then get it through, especially in the Senate side of things,
Yeah.
and of making sure we can get it on the floor and through as well. And it was a great win for the Assemblywoman and for my
Yeah.
senator. So
What we had to do is we also worked with Republicans, and so
Right.
we went from the Assembly to the Republican senators and said, listen, this is important to the city of Buffalo. Senator Kennedy is carrying it, and so all of the advocacy they were doing on their own was also supported by the advocacy that we're doing. And we use this as an example of how working together, even though they may be in the minority, we can get really quality legislation passed, which we did, thank God.
Right.
After a little debate, getting it out of committee, working with unions and the community, there was a lot of negotiation that happened behind the scenes to finally let that piece of legislation get through. And the same thing would work with any piece of library legislation that you may have.
And I think a component of that would help with libraries is kind of the broad coalition that there was for that bill. There were the unions, there were the residents,
Absolutely.
there were also medical professionals involved. If you can broaden kind of your appeal beyond just outside of libraries and librarians to include in additional
Educators.
teachers
Right.
or members of the community, the more people you can get on board, the better it is for chances to get things through the Assembly and the Senate
Absolutely.
at the same time.
Absolutely. I know there was a question about the budget process and how soon you should start the budget, like start putting your asks in. Because the library is underneath state education, state agencies have to submit their budget request to the governor. And they usually start about November. They do get an edict from what I understand, and we don't work in that level of government, that branch of government, but a lot of times they ask is that you keep things flat. And that's intentional, so don't take it, we don't want anybody to take it personally. It's because the governor also knows that either the Assembly or the Senate will put it back into their one House bill, which we can probably breeze over, but we can
Breeze over,
discuss
maybe.
it a little bit, not that complicated.
But I would still recommend always contact the state education department when they
Absolutely.
start putting it together. An example from this year, the Board of Regents asked for a certain increase of education funding. That same amount was not included in the budget.
Right.
But still, if you start early with them and can get involved with their ask, it's more beneficial for you. And even if the Department of Budget doesn't include it in their budget, it's still setting the process going for you going forward as we fight in the legislature for the more money that we want. But in terms of one House bills, we're at the time of taping, we're getting around the time to introducing our one House bills. In one House bills, the governor comes out with his proposal, his proposed budget, which is, if it was up to him, how he would want to see spending in each department and agency across the state going forward. And then the Assembly and the Senate kind of respectively come together. Well, they respectively have their own bills, which will then kind of show what the Assembly Democrats would want in it, what the Senate Republicans and the IDC would want in it, and then we will all debate it individually. We will debate it separately in our individual houses, pass it, and then once that's passed, that's when they come together and start negotiating through to try to get to a final budget agreement.
Right. So if you don't see what you're looking for in the governor's proposal, which you usually start seeing around the state of the state, well, we didn't have the state of the state in a traditional sense this year, but if you, you'll see the budget, it's usually put out there. Our staff, our Ways and Means and Program and Council staff, so central staff, reviews the budget. They put together a briefing book for the Assembly. They do the same thing, I believe, on the Senate side.
And the Senate Democrats have a blue book as well.
And we have a yellow book on the Assembly.
Ours is blue and the Senate Republicans are white. We like colors. So.
Yes, we do. It makes it very easy. It doesn't. What you do is it kind of summarizes everything that's in the budget. We have to read through the actual budget.
Right.
The summary is nice, but we go line by line. We look specifically what impacts Buffalo and Erie County. Have a great team of additional staff, a couple interns to help go through each line and see what the governor proposed, because those are things that you'd like to have the Assembly in their one House budget continue, like to keep in there, or to restore previous funding that was there before. We don't see it in the current governor's proposal. When they put the Assembly, there's a conference where majority members will meet together, or I guess you could say caucus together. They would meet in conference after session or before session, discuss various issues. So it could be, for example, library funding. Specifically, it could be Buffalo and Erie County library funding. This is why, and this is where the Assembly member would get up in front of her colleagues and share, this is what's important to my district in particular. We need to have X amount of dollars for X, Y, and Z. It must be included in the Assembly one House. And she would get her members on board with that. So you do lobbying within, well, you meaning they lobby amongst each other to get what they need to get into the budget to ensure they bring back the best resources, at least in theory, in the one House.
And we're very heavy in terms of budget letters to Leader Flanagan and to Leader Klein, because we like to make sure that they understand the issues that pertain to Buffalo and Erie County. So while Senator Kennedy does go into his conference and he'll talk about what's important to Western New York and what's important to Buffalo, we will also send out letters to Leader Flanagan and Leader Klein to make sure they know, what library funding should be, what other issues should be included in the budget, so that when they sit down and negotiate a one House between the IDC and the Republicans and take in some Democratic consideration, they will know what our priorities are, and we'll be looking out for those as they put that together.
And we do the exact same thing. We call them sign-on letters. So again, getting as many members to sign on to those letters as possible, depending on the issue area. If it's a very specific issue area, we may work with our Senate counterparts and send the letter both to the Assembly Speaker and to the Majority Leader and Senator Klein to make sure that they're aware of the need to have this certain funding for Buffalo.
Right.
I'm thinking of like NFTA and other
Right.
issue areas that there's a lot of crossover, and it's better because it's Buffalo specific that the delegation which is all of the members of the Western New York delegation work together on a piece of legislation.
And then you have statewide letters as well, which library aid funding has been statewide letters in recent years. 'Cause
Yes.
it's not just Buffalo and Erie County. If we can get an increase statewide, it benefits everyone. And there have been, since I've been in the Senate at least, there's been a letter at least every single year
Yes,
asking for
absolutely.
library aid increase.
That we both sign on to. Usually they're sponsored, well, chairs of each committee, at least on the assembly side, also put together a chair's letter. The chair of the committees look at all of the issue areas within that committee and the budget and what their impact, and make recommendations, either to reject something that the governor put in there, or, and this is specifically to the speaker, or we recommend that you accept it with this change or accept it as it is. Reject and restore, or reject and amend, or accept it as it's written.
And then I think after the one houses is when they really come together and start big negotiations. This is where committee chairmen will be involved and chairwomen will be involved in their kind of respective areas, but it'll also be a lot of leadership conversations between the speaker, Majority Leader Flanagan, Leader Klein, and the governor. This is where the governor gets back into the process itself, and they try to hash out a broad agreement, not just on library aid, but everything's linked together to them. Everything gets negotiated, and then they will come out with a final budget agreement to be voted on, typically very late towards the end in the process, right before April 1st. But and then this is where we have to go back through line by line, see what's actually in the budget, see what's not. And at that point in time, when they release a final budget, it's really difficult to add anything in at that point. So it's pretty much, you then vote what's there, what's set in stone, and then you vote for it, you're against it, and then that's kind of how it gets passed through.
Yeah, and this is where that whole idea of a 3-minute of a room comes in. Not real. There's more than 3 now, for sure.
And there's been better, especially on the assembly side, I feel, with more consideration.
The speaker, as opposed to previous speakers, he really listens to his conference. They each in that room, in that space, and it's a private setting, so as a staff person, though I can be in there, I don't repeat what was said to anybody, no matter what they ask. But the process is open enough for members to speak. This is how this impacts my district. This is what needs to be done. These are the kinds of dollars and why these dollars need to be added to the budget. You can't do this. You need to go back to the table and tell. And he does speak on behalf, truly on behalf of his entire conference when he goes back in the room. So I can't say that there's 3. I can probably say there's like 106.
And on the Senate side, we'll have our conversations with our leader, Andrea Stewart-Cousins. We'll have conversations with Leader Klein and Majority Leader Flanagan, and other members of the Senate Western New York delegation as well. The delegation throughout both the Assembly and the Senate really work very well together. They understand the importance of the shared interests that we have in this area. So making sure that everyone is aware and on the same page really helps going into those final budget negotiations in addition.
And they have these, it's called a Mothership, where they caucus together, meaning the chairs of certain committees all get together. So for the Assemblywoman as the chair of government operations, the chair of corrections, the chair of codes, the chair of the judiciary, all work together along with some of their Senate counterparts who may be in the minority, and gives them an opportunity to share what kind of things they'd like to see in the budget. From their point of view, it's not it's only majority and the Senate minority members, and we sit together and they hash out everything. Staff is there, Ways and Means, Programming Council, going line by line of the budget as it relates to their respective fields, and that's what helps put together. And then they have a hearing.
Yep.
And explain, this is what we're thinking about doing, this is what it's going to probably look like, and that's it. Then it goes to the floor for a vote.
Yeah, and then we vote, often very late at night.
Very, very late on March 31st.
And that's where, as a minority member, I have maybe a couple of hours to go through a couple hundred pages of multiple budget bills, which it's always great going through to try to figure out what's in and what's not, and then trying to message it in terms of how the senator should vote at the end of the day. So it's a lot of running around at the very end, trying to make sure you know everything in it as quickly as possible.
And we have a little bit more time than he does, but anyway, I guess that's how basically bills become laws and budget gets done all before April 1st, right?
Yeah. I hope some of this has been informative. I'm sure we live this every single day, so I'm glad we were able to really put a little bit of our knowledge forward to help everyone out.
Yeah, and if you have questions, you know how to find us.